AI training data is quietly reshaping human history by scraping, summarizing, and replacing the records future systems will learn from. Billions of historical documents are being fed into AI systems right now. But once they go in, the original records become invisible. A Civil War letter, a 1920s newspaper, a photograph from your town's archive. They all get scraped, compressed, and burned into a neural network. And the moment that happens, the source vanishes. Nobody can trace it back. Nobody knows where the AI learned it. The human story behind every record is gone, and we're only starting to understand the cost. In the next 18 minutes, you're going to understand exactly how this is happening and why institutions designed to preserve history are inadvertently destroying it. We'll show you which archives are being scraped. We'll prove what's actually inside AI training datasets. We'll walk through how context collapses the moment history becomes training data. And we'll confront a question that the Library of Congress is now asking itself. If we digitize history to save it, are we actually erasing it? This isn't about AI being evil. It's about a fundamental incompatibility between how archives were designed to work and how modern data collection actually operates. And the gap between those two systems is swallowing human history. Let's start with something that sounds impossible but is already documented. In August 2025, Reddit blocked the Internet Archive, one of the world's largest digital libraries, because AI companies had been systematically scraping its contents. Think about what that means. The Wayback Machine, the closest thing we have to a digital time capsule of human civilization, was being harvested without permission, without attribution, without any mechanism to preserve where the information came from. But Reddit's block was just the visible part of a much larger problem. AI training datasets like Common Crawl have been hoovering up public records for years. When researchers build large language models, they need enormous amounts of text, billions of words, trillions of tokens. Where do they get it? They scrape the web. They buy datasets. They mine institutional archives that were digitized for preservation, not for becoming invisible training data. Here's the mechanism. Those historical records enter a training pipeline. The original source, the archive, the institution, the museum that preserved it, the date it was created, the context around it, gets separated from the data. The algorithm doesn't care about provenance. It doesn't need to know that a Civil War letter came from a specific person in a specific moment for a specific reason. It just needs the text. The words become tokens. The tokens become mathematical patterns. The pattern gets baked into a model that will generate text that sounds like it came from that era, but has no connection to any actual historical record. This is context collapse, and it's permanent. The twist is almost too perfect to be real. The institutions digitizing history to preserve it are the same ones whose records are being consumed to train AI that erases the original sources. When the Library of Congress works with digital systems to catalog collections, they're not trying to harm archives. They're trying to make history more accessible. When universities digitize records, they want preservation. But the moment those digitized records become publicly available, searchable, discoverable, useful, they become targets for scraping. There's no comprehensive audit of what historical institutions are inside Common Crawl. Nobody knows exactly what's been taken and what context has been lost. That's not a conspiracy. That's a gap between institutional practices and the architecture of data collection. Archives were designed to preserve information. Data scraping was designed to scale it. They're not compatible, and nobody built the bridge. Now here's where it gets specific. Imagine a historical document, a letter from an enslaved person preserved in an archive, annotated by historians with context, date, source, and scholarly interpretation. That letter has weight. It has truth value. It comes with evidence of its authenticity. Now imagine that same letter's text gets pulled into a training dataset. The annotation is stripped. The author's identity is decontextualized. The date becomes just another token. The letter becomes a statistical pattern in a model trained on trillions of words. Years later, Someone asks an AI system to generate text about slavery in the 1800s. The model produces something that sounds historically plausible because it was trained on actual historical records. But it has no connection to any specific source. It's a statistical hallucination. It sounds real. It reads like history, but it's not. It's a compression of thousands of sources, stripped of their original meaning, flattened into patterns. The person reading it has no way to verify it. They can't trace it back to the original archive. They can't check the source. They can't understand the context. They just know it came from an AI that was trained on historical data, and that feels like evidence. The stakes are silent and permanent. When historical records are scraped for training data, they're not just used once. They're used to generate synthetic data, AI-generated text created by other AI systems. That synthetic data is then fed back into training systems, which generates more synthetic data, which compounds the distance between AI outputs and actual history. Future generations may only know history through AI-generated summaries and hallucinations, not the actual records. The erasure happens without deletion. The original sources remain in archives, but they become invisible. Nobody traces back to them. Nobody cites them. Nobody knows they exist. This creates an archive accessibility paradox. The more we digitize history to make it accessible, the more vulnerable it becomes to being consumed and transformed into something unrecognizable. The very act of opening history to the world makes it a target. Consider what this means for historical accuracy. When AI systems are trained on scraped archives without source attribution, they lose the ability to distinguish between primary sources, secondary interpretations, and errors. A misprint in a digitized newspaper becomes indistinguishable from historical fact. A biased account becomes weighted equally with scholarly consensus. The model doesn't know the difference. It just sees patterns. Archivists are now discovering their collections were scraped without their knowledge. Institutions are realizing they can't control what happens to records once they're digitized. The digital preservation they thought they were doing has become digital vulnerability. And here's the consequence. Future historians won't have access to the original records the way we do. They'll have access to AI-generated summaries of those records. They'll have statistical patterns that approximate history. They'll have synthetic data that was trained on data that was trained on data. Each generation of compression loses more context, more nuance, more humanity. The human stories, the specific reasons people wrote letters, the exact moment a photograph was taken, the authentic voice of a historical figure, those get flattened into tokens. And once they're tokens, they're gone. They can be recombined, regenerated, hallucinated, but they can't be recovered. So what does this mean for you? First, recognize the difference between AI-generated history and actual sources. When you read something that sounds historically plausible, ask where it came from. Can you trace it back to an original record? Can you verify it? If it came from an AI system, understand that it's a statistical approximation, not evidence. Second, source preservation matters more than ever. The institutions that maintain archives, that document provenance, that preserve context, they're doing work that can't be replaced by AI. They're maintaining the connection between records and their meaning. Third, data provenance and traceability are not optional. If historical records are going to be used in training datasets, there needs to be a mechanism to preserve where they came from, who created them, and what context they carry. That's not just an archival concern. It's a historical accuracy concern. Fourth, digitization is not the same as preservation. Making something accessible online doesn't guarantee it will be preserved. It might just make it vulnerable to being consumed and transformed into something unrecognizable. The erasure of history through AI training data is happening right now. It's not dramatic. It's not visible. It's just the slow, systematic transformation of human records into statistical patterns. And by the time we fully understand what we've lost, the original sources may be the only thing left to prove that history ever existed at all. If you care about historical accuracy, about preserving human stories, about understanding where information actually comes from, this matters. Share this with someone who works in archives, in libraries, in historical institutions. Help them understand what's happening to the records they've worked to preserve. And the next time you read something that sounds like history, ask yourself, is this from an actual source, or is this what an AI thinks history sounds like? The difference is everything.